There is a photograph, black and white, taken sometime in the late 1950s, where a young woman stands at the edge of the sea in St. Tropez, her hair tangled by the wind, her eyes half closed against the light, and she is laughing. Not posing, not performing, just laughing, the way people do when nobody is watching, when the world hasn't yet decided what to do with you. That photograph would come to define an era. That woman would come to define beauty itself. And yet, decades later, that same woman would lock her doors, pull her curtains, and disappear from the world that claimed to love her, not because she had nothing left to give, but because the world had taken everything it could and still come back wanting more. What does it do to a human soul to be worshipped and devoured at the same time? What happens when the symbol the world has made of you bears no resemblance to the person living inside your own skin? And why did one of the most photographed, most desired, most celebrated women in the history of cinema choose, in the end, to live alone on a hill in the south of France, surrounded by animals, speaking almost entirely to journalists about suffering? Not her own, but theirs. This is not a story about glamour. It never really was. She was born Brigitte and Marie Bardot on September 28, 1934, in Paris, France, into a world that was already tilting toward catastrophe. The streets of the 16th arrondissement, where her family lived in careful, measured bourgeois comfort, smelled of fresh bread and automobile exhaust, and the particular kind of quiet prosperity that belongs to people who have learned not to ask too many questions. Her father, Louis Pilou Bardot, was a wealthy industrialist, precise, demanding, a man who believed in discipline the way other men believe in God. Her mother, Anne-Marie Todi Musil, was beautiful in the contained, careful way of women who had been told that beauty was a gift to be managed, not expressed. Together, they created a household of expectations so high they were practically invisible. You couldn't see them until you had already failed to meet them. Brigitte was the eldest daughter. She had a younger sister, Marie-Jeanne, called Maginu, who would also eventually find her way to the screen, though never with the same volcanic force. From her earliest years, Brigitte was different. Not rebellious, not yet, but kinetic, luminous in a way that made rooms feel smaller when she entered them, not larger. She began studying ballet at age 7, and the discipline of it suited something in her nature. She would practice until her feet bled, until the bar had left marks on her palms, until the room was so dark she was dancing almost entirely by memory. There was a quality of total absorption in her that her teachers noticed immediately. When Brigitte committed to something, she vanished into it completely. By 13, she was accepted to study at the National Conservatory of Music and Dance in Paris. By 15, her face was on the cover of Elle magazine, a face so startling in its symmetry, so unconsciously sensual, that the editors reportedly argued about whether they had gone too far. She was a child. She was already an icon. The contradiction would define her entire life. It was at around this time that she met Roger Vadim, born Roger Vladimir Plemianikov, who was 18 to her 15, and who looked at her with the specific intensity of a young man who believed he had discovered something the rest of the world hadn't found yet. Her parents disapproved. Of course they did. Louis Bardot was not a man who welcomed the idea of his eldest daughter being looked at by anyone, let alone a penniless aspiring filmmaker with a Russian name and romantic ideas. But Brigitte was not, underneath the ballet discipline and the good manners, a girl who could be contained for long. She threatened to kill herself if they refused to let her see him. She was 16. The threat may or may not have been serious. Her parents took no chances. A reluctant engagement was announced. They married on December 21, 1952. She was 18. He was 23. And from the very first frame of their life together, Vadim understood something that Brigitte herself would not fully comprehend for years, that she was not simply a woman he loved, but a creation he could shape, and that shaping her would make him famous. He directed her. He dressed her. He introduced her to the people who mattered in French cinema. And when, in 1956, he finally put her at the center of a film called Et Dieu, Crée la femme, and God Created Woman, he didn't just launch her career. He detonated it. But before all of that, before the explosion, there was a wound. It came quietly, the way the worst wounds always do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of moments where a young woman realizes that the people who are supposed to see her are looking at something else entirely. Her father, for all his rigidity, had been her anchor. She had wanted his approval with a ferocity she could never quite articulate, and he had withheld it with the particular cruelty of fathers who believe that withholding approval is the same as building character. Every ballet recital, every magazine cover, every small achievement, she would scan the room for his face, looking for the thing that never quite arrived. Not coldness, exactly, just absence, the space where warmth should have been. Her mother was gentler, but bound by her own constraints, a woman who had been taught that feeling too much was a form of weakness, and who had passed that teaching on without meaning to. When Brigitte cried as a child, and she cried often, with the full-bodied abandon of someone who hadn't yet learned to be ashamed of it, her mother would hold her, but there was always a slight stiffening, a small withdrawal, as if emotion were a guest who had stayed too long. What this created in Brigitte was a hunger, not for fame. That would come later, and she would discover that it fed nothing, but for recognition, for someone to look at her and see not the face, not the body, not the symbol, but the actual trembling specific human being underneath. She would spend the next 4 decades looking for that person, in lovers, in directors, in audiences of millions, and she would not find it. Not once. Not really. That hunger is the wound. And everything that came afterward, every excess, every breakdown, every furious act of reinvention, was Brigitte Bardot trying to press her hand against it. The late 1950s arrived like a tide, and they brought with them the full catastrophe of global celebrity. After Et Dieu, Crée la femme became an international sensation. It was reportedly the first foreign film to gross over $4 million in the United States. Brigitte became something that had never quite existed before. She was not merely a film star. She was a phenomenon. The American press couldn't get enough of her. Simone de Beauvoir wrote a serious philosophical essay about her. Pablo Picasso painted her. Time magazine put her on its cover. The streets of Saint-Tropez, where she had gone to film and fallen in love with the light and the salt air and the bleached simplicity of the harbor, became a pilgrimage site. People came from across Europe simply to stand where she had stood, to breathe the same air, to feel adjacent to whatever it was she represented. What she represented, it turned out, was freedom, or a version of it that the world in 1957 was desperate to believe in. A woman who answered to no one, who moved through the world in her body without apology, who laughed the way she did in that black and white photograph at the edge of the sea. France was still recovering from the war. America was still buttoned up in its Eisenhower propriety. And here was this woman, young, French, impossibly beautiful, who seemed to have torn up the rulebook and was dancing on the pieces. But Brigitte herself was drowning. The divorce from Vadim came in 1957. She had loved him, in her way, but she had also come to understand that their marriage had been, in some essential sense, a transaction, his talent trading on her face, her body, her willingness to be photographed from every angle. She had given him the raw material of herself and watched him build his career from it, and somewhere in that process she had lost track of where Brigitte Bardot ended and the myth began. What followed was a series of relationships that the press would document with the enthusiasm of archaeologists who have found a particularly rich dig site. There was singer Sacha Distel. There was actor Jean-Louis Trintignant. There was, most devastatingly, Jacques Charrier, whom she married in 1959, with whom she had her only child, a son named Nicolas Jacques Charrier, born on January 11, 1960. The pregnancy was miserable. The birth was traumatic. The press camped outside the hospital. Brigitte, who had never wanted to be a mother in the way that the world seemed to demand, who had never been offered a model of motherhood that looked anything other than constricting, found herself unable to bond with the infant. She would later describe this period as one of the darkest of her life. The gap between what she felt and what she was supposed to feel was a chasm she could not cross. Nicholas was raised largely by his paternal grandparents. Brigitte would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of her life. And then, in 1960, she attempted to take her own life. She was 26 years old. She had everything the world said you needed to be happy. She was beautiful, famous, desired, wealthy, young, and she was sitting in a room trying to decide whether she wanted to continue existing. The details were kept quiet. This was 1960, and certain things were not discussed, but the attempt was real. The pain was real. And what is perhaps most devastating about it is not the attempt itself, but the reason behind it. Not one catastrophic event, but the relentless, grinding weight of being a symbol instead of a person, of being looked at by millions and seen by no one. She survived, obviously, but she didn't really emerge, not for a long time. She continued making films because that was what she did, because the machine required her, because stopping would have required a courage of a different kind than she had yet found. But something had shifted. Something had hardened and softened simultaneously, the way metal does when it's been through a fire. It was in this fragile, post-crisis state that she made some of her most extraordinary work. Le Mépris, Contempt, directed by Jean-Luc Godard in 1963, opposite Jack Palance and Michel Piccoli, is widely considered one of the greatest films ever made, and Brigitte's performance in it is heartbreaking precisely because she is playing a woman whose husband no longer truly sees her, a woman watching herself become invisible in real time. Whether or not this was intentional on Godard's part, whether Brigitte understood what she was channeling, is almost beside the point. The camera saw it, and audiences, without being able to name what they were watching, felt it. She met Gunter Sachs in 1966. He was a German millionaire and playboy, handsome, charming, extravagant in the manner of men who have never had to consider the cost of anything. He pursued her with a theatricality that was almost comedic. He hired a helicopter to drop roses on her villa in Saint-Tropez. He sent telegrams written in verse. He was, in every visible sense, exactly the kind of man the world expected Brigitte Bardot to end up with. They married in July 1966. They divorced in October 1969. He would later, in 2011, take his own life, and Brigitte, hearing the news, would grieve in the particular way of people who loved someone they could not save. By the early 1970s, something in Brigitte had simply had enough. She made her last film, L'Histoire très bonne et très joyeuse de Colline Trous Chemise, in 1973. She was 39 years old, and when filming was complete, she walked away. Not dramatically. There was no announcement, no farewell tour, no final bow to an applauding crowd. She simply stopped. She went back to Saint-Tropez, to her house called La Madrigue on the harbor that she had loved since the days of that black and white photograph, and she closed the door. The world, predictably, did not accept this gracefully. There were rumors. There were theories. There were photographers who scaled walls and hid in bushes and used telephoto lenses to capture images she had not consented to share. The hunger of the public, which she had spent 2 decades trying to satisfy, did not diminish simply because she had withdrawn. If anything, her absence made it worse. She became more mythologized in retirement than she had ever been in active life. But Brigitte had found something in the quiet. Something she had been looking for since she was a girl scanning the crowd for her father's approval. Not peace exactly, not happiness in the conventional sense, but purpose. And it came, unexpectedly, from the animals. It had always been there, her love of animals. On film sets, She had been known to stop productions when she spotted a stray cat. She had kept dogs, horses, donkeys, the full menagerie of a woman who felt more comfortable with creatures that couldn't lie to her or use her or decide she was a symbol rather than a living thing. But in retirement, it became the organizing principle of her entire existence. She founded the Brigitte Bardot Foundation for the Welfare of Animals in 1992. She sold her jewelry, including pieces given to her by some of the most powerful men in Europe, to fund it. She lobbied governments. She wrote open letters. She appeared before committees. She telephoned world leaders. She became, in the language of the press, a fierce animal rights activist, a description she would probably accept, though she might bristle at its tidiness. What she was, more precisely, was a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for that had nothing to do with how she looked or how the world perceived her. Animals needed her in the specific, unglamorous, daily way that audiences never had. They didn't want her image. They wanted her presence. And she was present. The house at La Madrague, still there, still overlooking that harbor where a young woman once laughed at the edge of the sea, became her world. She lived simply. She cooked. She tended her garden. She surrounded herself with rescued animals. She gave very few interviews, and when she gave them, she was unsparing in her honesty, about her regrets, about the industry that had consumed her youth, about the loneliness that had threaded through the brightest years of her life. She spoke, in one particularly memorable interview, about God, not in the practiced, careful way of someone performing belief for an audience, but in the halting, personal way of someone who has arrived at faith through the specific journey of their own suffering. She had not been raised in a particularly religious household. Her parents' world had been one of reason, propriety, order. But somewhere in the decades of excess and loss and silence, she had found her way to something she could only describe as prayer, not the formal kind, not the kind with words and kneeling and designated times, but a continuous, wordless conversation with whatever it was that held the universe together. She prayed for the animals. She prayed for the people who were kind to them. She prayed, she said, almost constantly. It was the sound of her life now, the way music is the sound of some people's lives. Her son Nicholas, whom she had given up in all but the most technical sense, made attempts at reconciliation over the years. The relationship was painful and complicated and never resolved into anything clean. She was honest about her failures as a mother in the way that people are honest when they have decided that the truth, however sharp, is less damaging than the alternative. She did not perform regret. She felt it. You could hear it in her voice whenever the subject arose, a quality of weight, of something that had been carried so long it had become part of the body. Her fourth husband, Bernard Durmail, a political advisor she married in 1992, brought a measure of stability, or at least consistency, to her later life. He was private, protective, committed. He was not a man who wanted to be famous by association. He was a man who wanted to be useful. And for Brigitte, who had spent so many years being surrounded by people who wanted pieces of her, the experience of being with someone who simply wanted her to be well was revelatory. She turned 80 in 2014 with very little fanfare, by choice. She turned 90 in 2024, and the French press covered it at some length. Articles that tried and largely failed to summarize what she had meant, what she still meant, and why people could not quite let go of her. The photograph from St. Tropez, the one with the wind and the sea and the unself-conscious laugh, circulated again, as it always does when her name is in the news. People looked at it and felt something complicated, nostalgia, longing, a kind of sadness that it is difficult to fully articulate. She remains alive, at her home in the south of France, as of this writing. She does not use social media. She does not give casual interviews. She fights, still, for the animals, sometimes in letters, sometimes in legal filings, sometimes in the blunt language of a woman who has nothing left to prove and therefore nothing to soften. She has been called difficult. She has been called mad. She has been called a recluse, a hermit, a cautionary tale about what fame does to beautiful women who are not careful enough with themselves. She would probably say that she is simply a woman who figured out, later than she should have, but earlier than never, what actually mattered. And now, here, at the end of this story that is not really an ending because she is still living it, I want to speak directly to you. Because that is the reason stories like this one exist. Not to make you feel better about your own choices by comparison, not to give you the comfortable sadness of looking at someone else's tragedy from a safe distance, but to ask you something real. You have probably felt, at some point in your life, the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who are looking at you and not seeing you. The loneliness of being known for something that is not the thing you most want to be known for. The exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that the world finds easier to handle than the actual one. Brigitte Bardot felt that. She felt it in the middle of the most photographed decade of her life. She felt it in Cannes and in Hollywood, and in the pages of every magazine that had ever put her face on their cover. She felt it in rooms full of people who loved her, and she carried it all the way to a house by the sea where finally, she allowed herself to want only what she could actually have. The photograph. That black and white image of a laughing girl at the edge of the sea. She is in it. The real her. Not the symbol, not the icon, not the myth. Just a young woman who loved animals and hated being told what to feel and danced until her feet bled and wanted, more than anything, for someone to see her clearly. What are you performing, right now? That has nothing to do with who you actually are. What have you been carrying so long that you've mistaken it for your own weight? What would you do? What would you become if you allowed yourself to walk away from the version of you that the world finds most convenient and go back to the harbor, to the wind, to the sea, to the thing that made you laugh before anyone was watching? Brigitte Bardot made her choice late. She paid for it in ways that were real and that she has never minimized. But she made it. She chose the animals over the applause. She chose the quiet over the noise. She chose, in the end, to be a person rather than an image. And that choice, imperfect, costly, made in the full knowledge of everything she was giving up, is the most courageous thing she ever did. More courageous than any film she ever made. More honest than any image she ever gave the world. More lasting than any of the men who thought they had discovered her. The sea is still there at St. Tropez. The harbor is still the same. And somewhere in a house on that hill, a woman who was once the most desired creature on earth is caring for an animal that cannot thank her, fighting for a cause that will never make her famous again, and finding in that invisible daily work the thing she was looking for in every frame of film, every lover's arms, every roaring crowd. The thing that was always there, waiting for her to come home to it. What is waiting for you?